So and I know everybody's not up for acting. I'm a very reluctant actor. In fact, I used to always say, I do not act. I'm quite happy telling other people to act and helping them. And then when I was a minister in England, the Anglican minister and I, because I was the general Protestant minister, which is called our church an evangelical church, and the schools would let us go into the schools if we went together. They weren't going to have one minister and not the other, because there were only two ministers in the village. They're group of villages. And this other guy, the one I worked with, the Anglican guy, he had been a real actor. He just loved acting. And I said, right, I do not do acting. And, you do that, I do this. And, there were some other things I could do. Well, within about a week you have me acting too, because you can't really act a story terribly well with just one person. So I became whatever else I needed to become, but I still say I prefer not to act. So if I have to do it, then I suppose I do it. Okay, so we can probably make a start. We're going to start with a Bible reading. That's a good idea, isn't it? There's so much in the Bible about pastoral care, that God's care for us and the call for us to care for other people, all of that. And most of the verses we turn to are in the New Testament, and there's loads and loads and loads there. We could spend a long time, if you're all telling me your favourite New Testament verses about this, but we're going to be looking today more particularly, more closely, at two Old Testament passages, and one in Ezekiel is the first one. Ezekiel chapter 34, and so I'd like somebody to read verses 1 to 6. And this is addressed to people who are called shepherds. But they're shepherds of Israel. And it means it kind of stands for the kings of Israel, but it stands for the leaders. Chapter 34. And God is not happy with the way these leaders are leading their people. Now, even if we're not leaders or we don't think of ourselves as leaders, the same principles apply to every single person, every single Christian person. By the way, the whole PowerPoint I can send to one of you people here, and then they can send it round at the end. So you don't have to write down everything that's on the PowerPoint. You can just write down for yourself any notes you want to make, anything that just, you see relevant, just do it that way. And then I will give you this, and there are a couple of pieces of paper that I'll give you along the way too. Okay, could somebody please read out in the last verse the first 6 verses of Ezekiel 34.
I'm reading from the NIV. Yep. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally, so they were scattered, because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them.
Pretty sad statement, isn't it? And yet the problem is, we see this pattern happening again and again and again and again, and again and again and again and again. And I must say, I've seen it in churches. We should never see this kind of pattern in churches. But unfortunately, unless we are pretty careful, we can do accidentally some of these things. So what are the things that stand out to you in that list of things that God's very displeased about?
Being inward looking and looking after yourselves, not the people outside of your body.
That's right. And so it can apply to you as an individual, not looking beyond yourself individually, or it can apply to your group, your church. Yeah. Okay, any other points from that?
I'm not open to being attacked by a beast of the field.
That's right. But as soon as people in need are neglected or mistreated, then there's bound to be someone else hovering around who is going to treat them as prey, who's going to to come into the gap, if you like, and start to pretend to be their friend, and yet then they can take them off into a direction which is unhealthy. I think we've probably seen this happen. So that's why it's important that we don't leave those kinds of gaps. I can think of a minister I know today in a country town in New South Wales. I won't say the name, his name or the church, but he came along to this church, country church, and he came along there. He was appointed as minister to start just over a year ago. The first thing he announced was, I'm not going to listen to any of you. I will be telling you what to do. I have all the ideas, and so there's no point you having any. That's what he actually said. I couldn't believe it. I know this church was a really, really good church, somewhat similar to Key to Life in size, and I was just shocked, and I thought, don't I realise something's wrong here? Well, it's part way through the year, probably by 6, 7, 8 months, all of the people who were sick, who had severe health needs, who were vulnerable, who were new Christians, anybody who had any kind of need left. Right? Because I know there was COVID, but he was ringing people once a fortnight. That was his pastoral care. But what he said to those people was just horrible. Well, the church elders have asked him to leave, so he's just gone. But they haven't learned their lesson. I would like to hope they've learned their lesson. But he was a young guy. He just thought he was going to repeat the pattern that he'd learned from somewhere, and he knew everything much better than everybody else. Arrogance. So you could sum up the whole of this as arrogance. So it's very sad because, my heart grieves because that was a really good church, and it was started by a friend of mine, a guy who baptised me when I was young, who's retired, but in his retirement he's still gone on to plant many churches, including this one. It was a good church. It really was a good church. And it's, at the moment, in severe decline. Let's read to see what God says he's going to do, because he's not going to just sit back and tolerate this. God is a God who will act in some way or another. So can we have someone else read verses 11 to 16, which is what God says, what he's going to do, and his kind of shepherding.
Well, thus says the Lord God, indeed I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out. As a shepherd seeks out his flock on the day he is among his scattered sheep, so I will seek out my sheep and deliver them from all the places where they were scattered on a cloudy and dark day. And I will bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries and will bring them to their own land. I will feed them on the mountain of Israel, in the valleys, and in all the inhabited places of the country. How far do I have to go? I will feed them in good pasture, and their fold shall be on the high mountains of Israel. There they shall lie down in a good fold, and feed in rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I will feed my flock, and I will make them lie down, says the Lord God. I will seek what was lost, and bring back what was driven away. Bind up the broken, and strengthen what was sick. But I will destroy the fat and the strong, and feed them in judgment.
Right, so that's that. The last verse is the verse we don't really read. But it's in there, so we read it. So what are the characteristics of God's way of shepherding? Because obviously, if God is a shepherd, that's the pattern that we should be following. So what is God wanting to do that's different from how these other bad shepherds were carrying on?
Care for the people, care for his people.
Care for the people.
Look after, nurture them.
Thank you. Love, nurture, look after,
He'll deliver.
heal, deliver,
Gives them the best.
search for them. What was it?
Gives them the best.
Gives them the best, the pasture. He looks out for the pasture where it's good. You know, you do that with animals. And, I mean, I'm not a farmer. We used to have some goats and sheep and that, you know, so that's our little play farming experience. But, you know, it's enough to tell you that that's what you do. You're constantly looking for the pasture. You don't want to be sending them into ground that's going, hello, welcome, take a seat where you can find one. Or two, So just sit down for the moment. Maybe when you have a break, you might want to make yourselves more comfortable and move around a bit more. And I'll get your names in a little while, because, you know, I would like to know everybody's name. Okay, so that's our little introduction. The last bit is about differentiating between sheep. Because, you know, there's not only bully leaders, there's bully sheep. And, you know, if we are, sometimes I think, you know, thinking of myself as a shepherd is a bit too grandiose. You know, I'm probably more like a sheep, and I've got to be careful of how I do my little mini shepherding of the other sheep who are alongside me. Because I think in our context of pastoral care, you know, God's the big shepherd up there, but most of our shepherding, pastoral caring, is we're walking alongside people. I'm a sheep. I'm nothing more than a sheep. And I have to look out for the other sheep. So therefore, the bully sheep, what are they doing? They're muddying the waters. They're getting there first, they're getting the best feed, and they're churning up everything so that the other sheep who come along can't get good feed. And some people like to do little things to make sure they are always getting the best, but they're actually stopping other people from being treated well.
Guys with the seagulls down there in the car park, you know, they hang around cars and you'll get one bully with a
It happens with animals.
Stop them from feeding.
Seagulls, it happens with chickens. We used to keep chickens. And I mean, the pecking order is very, very precise. So it's right through the animal world, and it's right through the human world, and it's right through every church if you go by our normal, natural kind of instincts. Now, one of the first things that one of the things we have to come back to again and again and again and again is how well do we listen? Because actually we're not going to treat each other well, we're not going to do good pastoral care if we are only half listening when we're talking with someone or hearing a situation. Right, you agree with that? Otherwise what we do, we go off half-cocked then what we do is we've got a little bit of the story and we then presume that we know what's right and what's wrong, and then we can fix it by giving them a Bible verse, or by giving them a direction, or by telling them you're wrong here, or telling them do this. We jump into that much more quickly than we, and we need to be first of all careful in how we listen. So I'd like you to be in pairs. We've got an even number here, and maybe the two people at the back, maybe you can go each with a different person from the front table. Is that all right? And nobody in the same family is allowed to be in the same pair. I stand corrected. No one in the same biological family. Well, we're probably ultimately in that too, but you know what I mean. And probably somebody you don't talk to. Well, I suppose this is going to be crazy. Just choose someone. Okay? So the two people at the back, if you can join in the two different people here. So one is, and what I'm going to do is, do we have an even number? Yeah. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, so Terry, who are you with? Okay, you're going there. Are you two going together?
And Wendy?
Yes, and Tony.
Oh, well.
Tony's a person. So, well, we could do it together. Yeah, we could do it together. Okay, Tony and I will do it. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I will be timing it, so I'll tell you when to start and when to stop. And I want you to think of an incident. It can be a happy one, or it can be a sad one, or it can be a difficult one. Don't make it too traumatically difficult, because we haven't got time to kind of mop you up and so don't open a can of worms. But something, an incident, any incident that you're happy to tell the other person that you've not told them before. So it might be something that happened down the street, or with somebody you're talking with or working with, or I don't know, it can be anything. Something that's probably happened in the last few weeks, but it doesn't have to be. If you can't think of anything in the last few weeks, but you can think of something 5 years ago, that's all right too. All right, if you picked your story, then you're going to tell.
Pastoral Care.
Any story. It's any story that you have been in. It's about you. Right? Doesn't matter what you felt.
I don't think we do.
No, it's any story.
Learning to active listening.
You just select a story that you're going to tell the other person. At least you're going to tell them 2 minutes worth, which is not long. And then, excuse me, quiet, you're not talking yet. And if you worked out between you who's person number 1, I'm telling Tony he's person number 1 because I haven't had time to think my story yet because I'm talking. Okay, so the person who's talking is the only person in your pair who's talking. The other person must remain silent. Now that's not very easy to do. It's only 2 minutes. But some of you are going to find 2 minutes is really a long time to remain silent. And you're going to listen, and then I'm going to ask you, the listener, to tell the person what you've said. Not word for word, but you know the gist of it.
Right.
So only one of us have to think of the story.
No, because then we reverse it. Then you swap. Right, so have you all worked out who's number 1?
Yes.
Right, okay. Then no other talking. Would somebody like to read it out? Somebody, yeah?
When I ask you to listen to me and you start giving advice, you have not done what I asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin to tell me why I shouldn't feel that way, you are trampling on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel you have to do something to solve my problem, you have failed me, strange as that may seem. Listen. All I asked was that you listen, not talk to, just hear me. Advice is cheap. 10 cents would get you both Dear Abby and Billy Graham in the same newspaper. And I can do for myself. I'm not helpless. Maybe discouraged and faltering, but not helpless. When you do something for me I can and need to do for myself, you contribute to my fear and weakness. But when you accept as a simple fact that I do feel what I feel, no matter how irrational, then I can quit trying to convince you and can get on with the business of understanding what's behind this irrational feeling. And when that's clear, the answers are obvious and I don't need advice. Irrational feelings make sense when we understand what's behind them. Perhaps that's why prayer works, sometimes for some people, because God is mute and he doesn't give advice or try to fix things. He just listens and lets you work it out for yourself. So please listen and just hear me. And if you want to talk, wait a minute for your turn and I listen to you.
Now, I mean, I don't actually think that God is mute all the time. So, there are some bits that we might take issue with, but I think the basic point is right. There are times when we need advice, but usually only when we've felt heard. You know, when we're assured that the person has genuinely listened to me and they genuinely care about me and they've kind of got where I am at and where I want to go and all of that, then and only then there may come a time when I want and need advice and they're the person I'll go to. But if that person has not shown that they really will listen, or they're just going to trample on my feelings and they're telling me, you shouldn't feel that way, have you ever been told that? I'm not going to go back to them for advice. The people I will go back to for advice are the people who I trust because they respected me enough to listen to me and accept me as me. And if I have feelings, we can't just switch on or off our feelings, but to accept that, whether I did right or wrong, these are my feelings. And then we might be able to get to the next place where they need to go. So the listening thing, I put on here, Solomon Hughes. Do you remember Solomon Hughes? He did a counselling seminar thing for a few days in Melbourne once I went to years and years ago. He says an evangelical disease is giving answers before listening to the problem. Can I suggest that this disease is in every single church that I know of, and so I can just make a guess that it exists in Key Life Church as well, simply because we're human. And we all have a tendency to do it. This is not something, nobody's exempt. And yet that is probably one of the single biggest reasons why people get unnecessarily hurt. So that's why the listening thing that we've been doing is really, really important. Okay, let's move on. So I've just put a little thing up there. I could put, there's loads more I could be putting on this slide. But good listening, when you really feel like the person has listened to you well, the person, when they're not limited to be silent like we just have been doing, there's usually small little signs of encouragement. There's a smile, there's a nod, there's an okay, there's a or there's just what do we say? I don't know what to do. It's hard to, but we make little sounds to just encourage the person to know, yes, I'm listening, keep talking, I'm still interested, I haven't gone away, you know, I'm not giving up that easily, that sort of thing. And the other thing is sitting at about the same level, and that's what we were doing today. I can remember going into a minister's office, won't say who or where, well, I know them anyway, but, you know, there was a minister sitting on the other side of this great big desk, and I hate talking to people on the other side of a great big desk. You know, he's in this big fancy chair, feet up on the desk, and I'm sitting in like a little plastic chair, and then I'm supposed to be coming and talking to him. Well, before anything else happened, I didn't feel particularly trusting. Do you know what I'm saying? And you know, we can do it in sort of subtle ways where we can turn people off with, you know, listening. Well, one of the ways we turn people off is by, this is the other thing I've been in conversations like this, I've probably done it, but you know, I'm more conscious of it now. Arms folded, that goes against listening. You know, the body position, we don't consciously think about it, but it does affect us. If there's a big barrier of somebody sitting up on a big chair and you're put somewhere down there, we kind of feel a little bit intimidated. We can. Now sometimes you can't help it because that's just the furniture. But if you can help it, try and you know, be fellow sheep. You know, we're not really some big guru up here. It doesn't matter how much experience we've had or how much we know, we're still fellow sheep. And we don't want to turn into body sheep. So bad listening is when you're not giving any feedback at all, you're just going, you're sitting with a blank stare on your face, or you're fidgeting around, or you're looking out the window, you know, all those sorts of things. You try to have a conversation with someone doing that. It doesn't really make you feel encouraged to keep going. You think, oh, you know, they just want me to finish. So you end up finishing before you really want to. Some people interrupt inappropriately. Interruption in order to ask another question to find out what's going on or something, that's fine. Interruption in itself can be either good or bad. But if it's inappropriate where it just cuts you off and like in the middle of a story and then they change the subject and you know, look out here, have a look at the beautiful geraniums out the window, and you think, I'm just at the really crucial bit where I'm telling you about when the burglar got in the window and you want me to look at the geraniums. Well, that doesn't really make you feel like you're being heard. So we've experienced that. We have to become more conscious of it. You sort of think this is everyday stuff. It is everyday stuff. But we have to become better at it. No matter how good we are now, we can always become better at it. So I've got another handout here. And we just do have many of these we get time to do. But this is more about listening for emotions. So there's a few little scenarios here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Thank you. So you can just talk about this in little groups at your tables or wherever you want. So I'll give you an example. Somebody says, hey, I feel great. I get to lead the team in the next project. And then you think about, what does a person feel? They feel happy, excited, exhilarated perhaps, relief that they are actually getting an opportunity. And then think about what you feel in listening to it. Now you might feel, if you were a fellow colleague, you might feel excited because you know this guy's really good at it. Or you might feel a little bit envious because you know you've been waiting your turn to get to be the team leader and it hasn't come yet, and you've been working there longer. And so then you can think, well, I don't feel like that. If I'm feeling envious, you don't tell the person that, but just good to think about it yourself. You start to think, why do I? Because that can be something that you pray about. That can be something that but once you've identified it, see, feeling is a signal. All emotions are signals of something that's going on inside us, often in our thinking, or something that's happened in the past, but often it's something we think, but we are not conscious of thinking it until an emotion is aroused. And then that can be a trigger to think, why do I feel like that? I don't want to feel like that. But identifying it is actually healthy. It's really healthy. And then we can start to untangle, why do I feel like that? Does that relate to something that happened over here? We can get to other places. Okay, so doing the, let's do different ones. Let's have this table over here. Do the second example, talking about feelings in groups is boring. You can decide what you do with that. The two at the back, maybe you can come and join. Yeah, that'll be better. And then you have three in each group. You can do the next one, and then you three, can you do the bottom one on that page? And just talk about it for a few minutes. Can we have some feedback from you, please? Wilfred? Pam? All right. So you're ready? Are you people ready? I've got better things to do. Okay, can someone from this group tell us what you thought here?
For the emotions that person would have been feeling, I got frustration and rejection.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Frustration is certainly there. It could have rejection there too.
In that they don't feel comfortable with people or groups or like that.
Yeah. Of course, we don't know the person, so we're all making guesses here. Thank you.
This is the first time or something's happening, like before it stopped them from actually sharing their feelings. So.
Yeah. Well, that's a possibility too. So what do you think you might feel?
I would have said, now is not the time to try and drag them into that type of situation.
Okay, that could be the case.
Sensitive to where that person's at. And then, I suppose because, it's obviously something's happened or we don't know why. And I suppose the answer to the last bit was because we're going to try and find out why that person, feels that way. So.
Okay, so you're going to go gentle.
So you can't force someone to share.
No, you can't force them. Okay, thank you. The next one down, I think, was the group at the back here. I should never have left him, I should have known.
Yes. So the emotions we came up with were sadness, frustration, regret, depressions, loneliness, and lost potential.
Yes, and lost potential has disappointed hopes, and the anger would probably be in there as well. Frustration is a version of anger anyway. It's just a lower grade anger. I remember,
That just said self-condemnation.
yes, self-condemnation, thank you. I can remember talking to the principal of our Bible college in England, you don't know that, and I don't want to disrupt the computer, so I'm going up here to start my phone, and he said to me, I will not get angry. There's a slight mismatch between the words and the actions here. Of course, if I stood there and corrected and said, well, do you realise this is that, then, off with my head it would have been. So, yes, but, it shows how easy it is for us. I mean, he'd been a Christian leader for decades. He was a very well-known Bible college principal. But he didn't know about himself. He didn't, so I couldn't say. So okay, the next part, what would you think?
Response, you feel empathy, sad for that person, but also an anger that you know that you see somebody in that situation.
Yeah.
And not that type of anger, but holy anger.
Yes.
Whereby you're saddened by the things that you see people having to go through.
Yes.
Unnecessary things like that. But that's all right. But there's that holy anger
Yes.
that can come in. And because we want to support people, we want to be able to listen as we discussed before, but we genuinely care for people and we want to see people, set free and living a life better than what they're living right now, or the situation that they're facing at that time. So just being able to help them step through to the next phase.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we can feel frustration because the other party listening to a story like that is, or we might even feel regret ourselves, is could we have helped the person before? Did we miss some opportunity? Sometimes we want to jump in and just change the situation when it's actually not ours to change. Because the decision has to be made by the person. So, a lot of things. Okay, great. The next one is this group here. I want my life back. I want it to be like it was. Well, the theme of 2020.
We felt that if that person was, well, I felt if that person was a Christian, I'd feel very sad. But I thought that they were missing out on something. They had stopped. They were stuck. Yeah, I mean, that was not a different, really different thing.
Okay, what are some of the other things?
Yeah, they were experiencing a sense of a lack of control in their lives, certainly a sense of grief over something they've lost, possibly anxiety and depression.
Wendy, have you got anything else to add?
Well, this is what we're agreeing with, I think.
Okay, all right, okay, fine. And what about the response? What might you feel?
Sadness, I think, sadness.
And empathy in the situation. And you might be the battery's running flat.
Okay, because
You wanted them to feel okay.
yes,
You wanted them to
we always want people to feel okay.
Yes.
Well, I think we're probably the sort of people that are in this room. We want people to feel okay. We're going to move on to the next thing. And I'm going to make myself a bit vulnerable here. If I had something else to share with you, I would have chosen that. But this is a little, what we call a verbatim. It's just a written down story of a conversation. And in this case, this happened years and years and years ago, and I had totally forgotten about it till I found it in my collection of, I've got folder upon folder upon folder upon folder and books galore on pastoral care, and you can't do everything in one day. So I was just picking out a few things that I thought might be helpful for us to do here. And this is something for you to read and then discuss in the group. So I am the Kathy. Normally I don't do things telling you that I'm the person in it, but I didn't have time to change it. So there we are. For better or worse, this is a hospital visit that I did you today. This is 2012 Lorraine. But the rest of the details are accurate. When I was training to be a minister, I was in Melbourne for part of that training, and so I was placed for part of it in the Uniting Church. And so they sent me out to do hospital visits. But I had to write down things like this because it was meant to be a training purpose. So that's the context. So because I was working with the Uniting Church and this lady was listed as a Methodist patient, so I was told that I had to go to see her. I didn't know anything about her until I went there. And often in churches we do know the people, so it's not going to be this kind of conversation. But occasionally we will be talking to people that we know nothing about, apart from what they tell us. So I want you to have a quick read through and really think about, and you're allowed to criticise me. You know, even if I feel hurt, I'm still going to stand here. Don't worry about that. It's just an exercise. How well do you think Mrs. Turner felt after this conversation? And what were the things that I did, I wish I could say it wasn't me, that were helpful, good? Was there anything I missed that I could have done that might have helped her more? As I said, you can it's up for criticism.
There's probably something too that when you've gone in a situation to talk to people, we probably have to, if we analyse what we have done, we would have come back and said, I should have done that.
Yeah.
Hindsight is a great teacher.
Yes, and we all make mistakes. We all forget doing something, we all think later.
And you think, I should have done it.
So you're allowed to say if there's something that you think could have been helpful. As I said, I barely remembered this until I found it in my, one of my folders. Okay, so just have a bit of a read and then we can talk about it in groups. Each group, and we just go like that so that we get a collection. I know that you've been talking, so I presume you've been saying something relevant. Okay, so what about the top table over there? So,
You were
affirming. Okay. Thank you. Okay, at the middle table.
That's a really good thing for me was the fact that she said, can I pray for you? And the lady went after the prayer, it's so good to have a Christian in the family.
Yes.
This visit she got comfort that was far beyond anything that you
Yeah, and you never know when you go offer to pray for someone in a hospital setting or nursing home or whatever. You have no idea what the response is going to be. But I've found that more often than not, people are happy to be prayed for, even if they don't believe. Because I can think of one lady when I took a funeral for a mother in England. She said, and I want you to have prayers. I said, but you've just been telling me that you don't believe in God and you don't believe in prayer. She said, no. She said, I don't believe. She said, but I hope you believe. So I said, yes, I believe, so I'm happy to pray. So she said, Mum believed, and she said, it would be good to be able to believe. She said, I don't. But she said, if you can believe, then please do it. And so I could think of one situation of a lady in a nursing home in Hobart. Again, we won't say names because you don't know who's related to who. But I was a chaplain there part-time for at one stage, and this lady, I went to see her, and the previous chaplain, who I don't think believed much that was similar to what I believe, she had asked him every day every time he visited, for 13 years, to tell her about heaven, in the future. Well, he couldn't because he didn't believe in it. So she kept asking. Anyway, so she got to me, and so she asked me the same question. I can't remember now what I said, but I did give her some basic stuff and about faith and believing in Jesus, the basic gospel stuff. And no, she said, I can't believe that. I said, that's fine. And then I said, well, would you like me to pray for you? She said, well, I don't believe in that either. I said, but I believe. And she said, well, if you believe, you can pray. It's a similar kind of thing. So I prayed that God would help her to believe.
Yes.
And the next day I had a phone call from a nurse who was on duty who was a Christian. And she said this lady had decided that what she needed to do was to confess her sins to this nurse. And this nurse then, I was able to, because this lady said, I'm ready now, I need to confess my sins and I need to believe. I didn't see that, I wasn't there. But this nurse did. That's the Holy Spirit. All I could do was pray that God would help her to believe. Since believing was the topic of conversation. And then immediately after that she went into a coma. And then after that she died. But in that, or not immediately after, because she must have spoken to a family member, one of her sons, and she told him that she was now a Christian.
Wow.
And then she went into a coma, and then she died. So then, that son rang me and said, I want you to take the funeral because you've got through to Mum. I thought, well, my bit was only a few minutes here, but it included a prayer that was answered the next day. When I wasn't there, so I didn't actually see that. You just never know. And other people, I've got no idea. I've prayed things for them. I've got no idea what's happened. They're just too good. Okay.
That must have had a big impact on her after 13 years of knockbacks.
Well, yes, it was. I thought if this lady's been asking for 13 years, that's going to be serious seeking.
Yes.
And it was the chaplain who couldn't.
But God used that, it probably built up in her.
It probably built up her thirst.
It just got released.
And then, I suppose, that's what also emboldened me to pray like I did. Because I thought this lady, I just felt, my heart went out to this lady who's been seeking for 13 years. It's like,
None of us kept her alive.
Yes.
In that moment.
Yes.
So people wanted...
She was very elderly, something like 99.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. So I think exactly that, she was kept alive. So, we just never know where, something that we call pastoral care ends up bringing someone into the kingdom. Pastoral care evangelism, they all go together, don't they? Okay, any other comments that you want to make? Well, maybe we should turn to the things that I perhaps could have done and didn't do. What might I have done? Maybe if there was more time, or maybe just because you can see a gap there,
I just felt in the first bit you were a little bit nervous.
Probably.
A little bit. So when she invited you to sit on the bed and you said, well, could I sit on the stool? Maybe that might have opened up a little bit more if you'd have sat on the bed, I don't know.
Well, you know what I said about sitting at the same level?
Yes.
She was sitting on a chair, a comfy chair. She was down there. Beds up here. So I looked around the room and I wanted to sit closer to her.
Okay, that's good.
So that's why I did it. And your point about, was I nervous? The answer is yes.
Well, I think you relaxed into the conversation.
I think that's inaccurate.
Well, that's because you get to know them a tiny, tiny bit.
Yeah. So you do actually form a connection, even though that is the only time I ever saw that woman. She probably died soon afterwards. So you think, sometimes you can have a conversation that's only 5 minutes.
Yes.
And it could be profoundly significant to someone. You just never know. You sort of think, is this worth doing?
Well, I read through that one. Obviously, we don't have all the information, and I've always said to people, do not run with anything without checking out both sides of the story. So many people do it. Christians do it all the time.
Yeah, that's true.
They make a judgment based on the bit that they've heard, and they don't check out the other side of the story. And that whole thing over there is a brilliant example. So even
but certainly when somebody's telling you a story about another family member, you don't know who is telling the truth at this point. You only have this person here, and you can acknowledge their feelings, but the facts of the matter may be quite different. It might be it's because they're affected by dementia, or it could be that they're outright lying, or it could be that they're trying to hide something for some reason because they're scared of somebody knowing something. There's a lot of things. You can't be God, you don't know everything, so you be cautious. Yeah, that's a good point, Pat, thanks. All right, now we're going to move on to the book of Job. The book of Job, okay. Well, this is one of the best pastoral care training manuals that we have. It's a book of how not to do pastoral care. And often we can learn best from how not to do something, because that highlights what we, makes it clear what we could be doing or should be doing. And then first of all, we're not going to read every chapter and every verse, otherwise we'll be here for a much longer time than we have. But we're going to read bits of it. But first of all, I want to introduce the book of Job by telling you something that happened to me and to Stuart, that when God said to read the book of Job, so how it related in this way. When we were first married, we lived in Brisbane, and we met at university in New South Wales in Armidale. Then Stuart went to Brisbane before he got married, and so he joined a church, a Bible-believing church. He'd been brought up in the Presbyterian church, which was about as liberal as dishwater. I didn't really, Stuart never really knew what they believed. So when he became a Christian at uni, he realised that he needed a church that actually, to start with, read the Bible, believed it, related to God, basic stuff like this. So he quickly found this church that seemed to tick those boxes. Then we were writing letters, we got engaged in the marriage. And so when we got married, I joined him in Brisbane and went to that church. Now, I was quickly very alarmed by that church. And he had some discomfort with it, but I think when he went up there, he was only 20. He graduated from uni early. And so I went to uni when he was 16. So he did an honours degree when he was 20. And so he was working as biochemist. So every every single service, the church was saying about how they're the only true church around us, and that every other church was what's the word? Apostate, that's the word. The other language. Every other church was apostate, and if they met anybody from another church, they would not shake hands with them. And so I thought, that's a bit rough. And to summarise my emotions, I cried at some point every day for 10 years because of that church. And I just couldn't cope with this way of doing acting or teaching or relating or anything. And the way they treated people in the church was that if anybody had any slight disagreement with any of the elders or anything about anything, then that you got excommunicated. And the name was read out, and nobody's allowed to speak to them, nobody's allowed to, otherwise you'd be excommunicated too. And that might give any, this is just the tip of the iceberg here, but it might just tell you that relating to anybody was pretty scary, because they could report anything you said in a conversation after church, over coffee. Could go straight to the elders, and then you get a visit from the elders and you're at risk of excommunication. So they made a rule that nobody was allowed to marry anyone from another church, but they made that rule after we got married, fortunately. And then they made a rule you're not allowed to move to a town without their permission, because once you joined the church, you were not allowed to resign. You could only leave by excommunication. And so while we were there, I can remember one young family who had, a little toddler who was, a 1-year-old. Sometimes this little toddler ran in the church, during the service. And so that family was excommunicated. There was one of the elders of the church had a nervous breakdown and went to visit a doctor, was put under a psychiatrist and was hospitalised only for a short time, about a week. And so he was excommunicated because he had gone to a doctor for a mental health condition. Well, he was actually employed by the church as well, so he lost his job. And they were going to just excommunicate the husband, but then the wife wouldn't be allowed to talk to him. And she said, no, I'll be excommunicated too. Because it was setting up an unworkable situation. If you asked any questions, we wrote down a list of questions of concerns we had. And so we thought that the fairest way, I don't know whether it was, but this is what we thought, was to send this letter to the minister and then ask him to arrange a time so that he knew ahead of time what the questions were that we were going to ask. We wanted to give him every opportunity. We might be understanding things wrong. We were only young. He was older than we were. When we were married, I was 22, Stuart was 23. So it was that sort of period. So we sent that. Well, we had the meeting on a Friday night, and we discovered that we were not allowed to speak. So the minister shouted at us at the highest possible volume without a break for 2 hours. And so there was no answering any of the questions. Basically it was, how dare you ask any questions? So then they told us, anyway, we'd moved away, and then so they didn't really like that. Then they sent elders down to visit us in northern New South Wales, and we had to go up and purify elders. And the chief person, the minister, he read out, not from Stuart's letter, by the way, I never joined the church because I thought If I join the church one Sunday, I'm going to be excommunicated by the next one. And that's not real good way to start marriage. You know, he won't be able to talk to me, and we were terrible. But we were still in the same kind of boat. And they wanted us to move back to Brisbane. But God was telling us no, we should, Stuart was going to retrain to be a teacher. Which they didn't want, they just thought we needed to be back in the fold, so we were totally under their influence. And I didn't want to be anywhere near their influence. And so we were really struggling, and Stuart was going back and forth, because he'd chosen to go to this church, but he didn't like a lot of the stuff, and he also kept wanting them to give them the benefit of the doubt and to respect them as elders, you know, all that. Anyway, somewhere in the middle of all of our turmoil and struggle, I was in the backyard feeding the chickens. It's always important to get the main bits of the story. And I called out to God from the chook house, and I said, God, this doesn't make sense for real Christians to be excommunicating real Christians, and the reasons for excommunicating when there was nothing even, you know, immoral or criminal. There's nothing even like that. It was stupid stuff, and it grieved me. It grieved me that the body of Christ that is meant to be together and will be together. What is happening? You know, how do I understand this, God? And he said, read the book of Job. Now that afternoon, we had 3 children at that stage, all very little. All 3 of them had been put to bed for a little afternoon sleep. But, you know, normally the eldest one would be up fairly quickly, and then, you know, according to their age, they'd get up. And they were all put to bed straight after lunch. Now, all 3 of our children slept until breakfast the next morning. The one and only time that ever happened. When Stuart walked in the door after work in the biochemistry laboratory, I said, we need to read the book of Job. I have no idea to this day, and he doesn't either, whether we actually ate tea or not. And we read all 42 chapters of the book of Job, uninterrupted by kids, no crying, no nothing. They all were asleep until the breakfast the next morning. It was that important. And what we found in reading the book of Job, because we basically had read, you know, the bit at the beginning, the story at the beginning of God and Satan talking about Job, and then the bit at the end where after the suffering's over, you know, things are restored. But what about the 40 chapters in the middle? That's the meat of it. And it was those 40 chapters in the middle that helped us profoundly. It was those 40 chapters where we heard the same kinds of words as we were hearing from the leaders of this church. Over and over again, every single chapter we read, every word of that book. And at the very end of the book of Job, Job was instructed to pray for his friends. God instructed us to pray for that church. And 10 years later, and it's either to the day or the week, 10 years later, we were coming back from a missions trip in Korea, and we went through Sydney Airport. My sister was in Sydney. She came out to see us at the airport. We were on our way to fly back, you know, down to here. And I went to the ladies' bathroom. All these fun bits that end up in stories, but I was away. Came back after that, and when I was approaching the table where Stuart and my sister were there waiting with their coffee, there was the man that was the minister from that church. Because I could just see the back of his head. He was, you know, he had his back to me. Now, I had been wakened by a dream that morning in Singapore, on our way back from Korea, that of meeting this man again. It was a very, very vivid dream. And there was a whole sequence that happened where he stood up, turned around, faced me and shook my hand. So the shaking hands was the thing they wouldn't do. And our names were read out of all their pulpits, you know, don't have anything to do with these people. And they even warned other churches that they were not to talk to us. So, anyway, so they had this dream in the morning, and now I'm in Sydney airport, and I see the back of this man's head. This is how the dream started. I could see the back of his head. And then it all happened exactly as in the dream that morning, where he stood up, turned around, faced me, shook my hand, but he added one more thing, gave me a kiss on the cheek. What is going on? Like, why is he even talking to us? And he said the Holy Spirit had convicted all of the church leaders. They'd had a big church camp thing, and they were all there. And if one person had disagreed, that person would be excommunicated. That's how they dealt with everything. But all the leaders were convicted by the Holy Spirit at the same time that they had to re-examine every single one of their excommunications and put things right. And they were up to us, and they didn't have our address because we'd come down here. And this was still at the airport. So that's the end of the story. So God told us to pray, so we did, and 10 years later that was answered. So while they would talk to us, it's all right, you know. We got a letter to say that and everything, but you know, they were wrong. There was no sin that we had committed, and they even offered to contact any churches to try and put that right. So that's amazing. Things don't always work out quite like that. But it was a story paralleling the book of Job. So if you've got your Bibles there, so we're going to read some bits. And the first thing is basically what I've said. This book is how not to do pastoral care. You know, we often skip over these big sections in the Old Testament, but they're full of very rich teaching. We want to get to the easy bits or, you know, little one-line verses or something. So we know the introduction where, you know, Job has all these terrible things happen. He's lost his children have all died, his animals have all died, and now he has sores all over his body. He's sick himself, as well as in extreme grief, and his wife doesn't seem to be quite able to do pastoral care either. We're going to skip that bit, but you know that bit of the story. So then we have the visit of three friends. Now we can assume these three, they're all believers. We don't know exactly where this happened. It doesn't say it was in Israel. We don't know where. It doesn't matter. We don't exactly know when either, and that doesn't matter. But we know that Job is a believer, and we also know that the three friends are believers. So that's important, because this is basically showing us that this kind of thing can happen inside churches, not just outside churches. So we're going to read, if somebody can read it for us, chapter 2, verses 11 to 13.
Now when Job's three friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shunammite, Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognise him, they lifted their voices and wept. And each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head towards heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great.
I can remember studying the book of Job with students in Ethiopia, because we lived there for 1 year and we were teaching in a graduate Bible college. And I only went to one person's house where they'd lost a family member, but this is the custom still in Ethiopia. You go and you sit and you do not say anything at all. You're all sit in silence for a few hours, and then you might be free to go. The only thing they'll offer you is little dried corn, little things. But, there's nothing else that happens. You just sit. And then the people usually feel like we've done enough of that. We'll go back to our lives and, But it's, so the custom, even in, we have a daughter-in-law from Thailand, and even that sort of custom still happens there. So it's a pretty common custom, and it still happens in parts of the world. That part of what the three friends did was right. So they are intent. These are not bad people. These are people who actually want to be pastoral carers. They want to sympathise. They want to comfort. They want to be with. And they do a great job for 1 week. Then Job opens his mouth. And then that's when things start going wrong. So can we have, this is a long reading, Job chapter 3 verses 1 to 10. Somebody happy to read that for us?
After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job spoke and said, May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, the male child is conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. Oh, may that night be barren. May no joyful shout come out of it. May those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. May the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light but have none, and not see the dawning of the day, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes.
Wow. Gee.
Okay, let's do the same exercise as we did before. What emotions is he expressing?
Deep grief.
Deep grief.
Yeah, and he's cursed himself too.
So what was that? Helplessness. What else?
Regret.
Regret. Depressed.
Hopelessness.
Hopelessness.
But he's cursing too.
And he's cursing. That's pretty strong language. Is he cursing God?
Self.
No, it's more like cursing himself. He can't see any future for himself.
No hope.
And he's lost hope. Cursing the day he was born, wishing he'd never been born.
Wow.
Now,
Thankfully he lived then, not now where he'd be stuck in the clinic and filled with drugs.
well, that's probably true too. What do we feel hearing that? What would we feel if we were sitting, like we've just come to comfort this guy, and he starts letting out all of this, and he goes on and on and on longer than what we've just heard.
Overwhelming sadness at what he's saying in the situation.
Getting it off his chest at least.
What was that? Getting it off his
Getting it
chest?
off his chest.
I feel helpless in the light of such grief.
How would we speak back? What might we do or say? if somebody, I mean, this happens. People get like this. And look, you've got to remember, this is not somebody that we would normally regard as weak. It's not somebody we call a vulnerable person, except that right now he is. He's somebody that we've been looking up to as a leader in the church. He's a leader in the community, and he's got, you know, a big business with all of these animals and employees, servants and whatever. He's known far and wide as a leader, as a man who is righteous, a man of integrity, a man who is a believer. He has taught and led like a lot of other people. Somebody who we have thought of as being strong.
I think I want to reach out and touch him.
You touch him, bear in mind he's got sores all over his skin.
You're going to comfort and encourage somehow. Don't know how. Empathise.
Let him know that you hear his pain, that you can't understand it, but you hear his pain.
I think that's a very good point, Christine. So what? How could we do that?
Just listening. Being quiet.
Would that mean like continuing? You've just had a whole week of being silent. Would you just stay silent for the next part, or we're going to find out what the friends did in a minute? But what do you think you might do?
I'm going to pray.
Just pray to God, yeah.
I'll be sending up prayers for God to say, what do I do? What do I do?
What is that, Linda?
I'll be throwing up arrow prayers to say, Lord, what do I do? What do I do?
Yeah, so I'd be inside, you'd be doing the arrow prayers. And Bert, would you be praying out loud, or?
Yeah, I'd be asking, can I pray out, pray for you?
Yeah.
Situation, do it without asking. But yes, I pray out loud.
Any other ideas? There's no right and wrong answer here, by the way. I mean, we don't really... And until we're thrown into this situation...
Asking questions. Because you ask, why this, why that, why that. Isn't he opening the door then for them to try and answer his questions? And isn't that... So, you can really, if someone's asking these questions, what do? Do you keep quiet, or do you try and give your perspective? Because that's where it all goes wrong.
I think we've got to distinguish between a genuine question that is looking for answers and a rhetorical question, which is really just getting it off their chest. Where, just because they ask a question, it may be that he's ready for you to say something, or it may be that he's not interested in any answers at all, just for the moment. He's just saying it.
Wanting someone to hear.
He's just going, it's almost like what he'd say to God, except he's saying it out loud.
It's a real...
Venting his feelings.
What's that?
Venting his feelings.
Venting his feelings, yes. So let's look to see what the first friend, we've got three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So I've just got a couple of verses which represent, it's a much bigger conversation, of course. But I've just picked out a few, so we'll have a few readers. Okay, who's going to be Eliphaz? Somebody read Eliphaz? Can we have some volunteers? Okay, no one's Eliphaz. Who's Bildad?
Just pick someone.
Well, I don't know if there's anybody here that's nervous about reading out loud. That's why I'm a bit scared of picking someone. What's that? You'll do it? And what is your name? Pardon? Mark? Matt. Sorry, my hearing's not brilliant. And next to you?
I'm Bernadette.
Bernadette. Matt and Bernadette. And I've got to get those some other names over here in a minute. Okay, so we've got Matt is going to be Bildad. Zophar, who's going to be Zophar? Tony Zophar. And who's going to be Joe? A bit more reading, Christine. Okay, so we're having this little play. You just sitting where we are. If we just make sure you speak up so everybody can hear you. So we're just going to go through all these verses in order. Right?
Your words have helped the tottering to stand, and you have strengthened feeble knees. And now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is it not your fear of God, your confidence, and the integrity of your ways, your hope? Remember now, who ever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plough iniquity, and those who sow trouble, harvest it. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they come to an end.
Anyone who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. For my brothers are as undependable as intermittent streams, as the streams that overflow when darkened by thawing ice and swollen with melting snow, but that stop flowing in the dry season and in the heat vanish from the channels.
Verse 3-4. Does God pervert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice for the children who sin?
Just read it loud.
Oh, sorry.
Can you start again, just read it loud?
Yeah. What is it, verse 3, 4, 20?
Yeah, 3, 4 and then 20.
Does God pervert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? If thy children have sinned against him, and he hath cast them away for their transgression.
Verse 20.
Behold, God will not cast away a perfect man, neither will he help the evildoers.
Indeed, I know that this is true, but how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God? Though they wished to dispute with him, they could not answer him one time out of 1,000. How then can I dispute with him? How can I find words to argue with him? Though I were innocent, I could not answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy.
So far?
Okay, so far. So Job 11, 3-6. Should your babble silence men? And when you mock, shall no one shame you? For you say, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in God's eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves.
Can anyone bring charges against me? If so, I will be silent and die. Only grant me these two things, God, and then I will not hide from you. Withhold your hand far from me and stop frightening me with your terrors. Then summon me and I will answer, or let me speak, and you reply to me. How many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offence and my sin.
Right, now I know that there's a lot of words in between that we didn't do, so it's probably a bit hard to get it. But what are some of the things you notice about what the friends are saying?
You deserve what you've got.
Is there anything else? They're judging him.
Yeah, there's no compassion at all.
No, thank you. No compassion. What about what Job's saying?
Almost agreeing with what Job's saying about himself. By them affirming that, okay, that's how you are.
You mean the hopelessness and things like that. You've got what you deserve, so that's just it.
But Job doesn't match up with what he knows about God. He's been taught, God loves you, God blesses you, God takes care of you, and he's done everything he can to make sure that he lived up to that. And now people are telling him that he hasn't loved God, he hasn't done anything to obey God, he's been subversive and sneaky, and he's got what he's deserved. He's going, God, you're a God of justice, you're a God of mercy, you're a God of love, and he's only these three friends for a start. It's not fair. And do I get a chance to tell you it's not fair?
Any other comments about what Job is saying?
I don't deserve this.
I don't deserve this, yes. He's not claiming to be perfect, but he is claiming not to deserve this.
There's a big clue in the first chapter where he's fearful about, whether his children might get into trouble and he has difficulty trusting God to them. And then Satan comes along and he's got a little bit of a leg in the door because of that.
Well, that's a possibility. It's not proven in the story, but it's a possibility. We do find that one of the friends is saying, well, your children deserved it. They sinned because of their sin. That's why they died. Well, what do they know? Do they know? Have they got evidence that their children committed the kind of sin that would mean they should be killed? No, there's no evidence at all. They're just making an assumption that if something bad happens, then you must have deserved it, and if something bad happens to your kids, they must have deserved it.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that Job has been very meticulous about teaching his kids what's right. You know, he can't force them to, make their own decisions. Does that anxiety that Pat mentioned, I don't know the answer to this question, does that talk about Job's own problem, personal problem of, over-watchfulness in a sense, or is it a reflection of his heart as a parent to say, I want my kids to do right and I want, we can't say exactly.
Yeah, no, you can't.
But that's all possibilities in there. This is a picture I found that I think pretty much sums it up. And yet, I think what can happen in church is that a finger gets pointed at people who are the strong. It's not just... So actually we tend to be a little bit sympathetic to those who are weaker than we are. And we put them down there so we can show them sympathy. Do you know what I mean? And what about if somebody's up there and then they're suddenly in crisis? Like that church with that elder in Brisbane who hadn't had a breakdown. He was the best preacher in the church. And a wonderful man. He and his wife really were our best friends in that church. And one of the things that caused us to be excommunicated, legally Stuart, but effectively me too, was that we did see them after the excommunication. So that was the end of us too. So, now there's a little bit more here, and I'm just thinking of lunchtime and all that. I don't know what time do we have it's whenever, isn't it? Okay, let's maybe do this. Can we have the same Eliphaz and the same Job, just for simplicity, to just have a little bit more in the conversation?
Indeed, you do away with reverence and hinder meditation before God. For your guilt teaches your mouth, and you choose the language of the crafty.
When your long-winded speeches never end, what ails you that you keep on arguing? I also could speak like you if I was in your place, if I was in my place. If you were I could also speak like you if you were in my place. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head to you, but my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief.
And Marion?
I'm sorry.
22, 4 to 11.
This is because of your reverence that he reproves you, that he enters into judgment against you. Is not your wickedness great and your iniquities without end? For you have taken pledges of your brothers without cause and stripped them naked. To the weary you have given no water to drink, and from the hungry you have withheld bread. But the earth belongs to the mighty man, and the honourable man dwells in it. You have sent widows and they empty, and the strength of orphans has been crushed. Therefore snares surround you, and sudden dread terrifies you, or darkness that you cannot see, and an abundance of water covers you.
Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. The one who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I put on righteousness as my clothing. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth.
So what Eliphaz is accusing him of, without evidence, Job is saying, I'm not perfect or anything, but he stops and reflects. He thinks, did I do any of these things? Well, that's a good thing to do, because if somebody does tell you you're guilty of this or this, you might be, or you might not be. And sometimes for me the answer has been yes, I was wrong, and sometimes it is no. And you go through and self-examine with God, did I do any of those things? And he's remembering, and you say no, this doesn't fit with the way I've lived, it doesn't fit with my reputation, it doesn't fit with what I've been conscientious about. So it's wrong. The accusations are wrong. And that's what happened with this church in Brisbane as well. But we won't spend more time on that. So, then at the end of the book, there's two more people who speak. One is a young man called Elihu, and he says, well, to the friends, well, you've got no evidence. That part was right. But he says, I still think Job must have sinned somehow, because otherwise his suffering wouldn't have come. So he doesn't really help. Then God shows up. Now if we think up to now, have any of the people in the story spoken to God? Now Beth said before that she prayed, and Linda said about that. Who has spoken to God? Has anyone spoken to God? Job has spoken to God, and he's even shouted at God. He's spoken to God in very strong terms. But he has been, right through this book, speaking to God. He hasn't actually let God go. We see not one prayer from any of these friends, or even from this fellow Elihu. Only one person has had his face to God, saying, I don't understand, and if I'm wrong, just, please help me. And then, of course, Job has a lovely line about, I know that my Redeemer lives. He doesn't know what's going to happen, he doesn't know how it's going to happen, but somehow he still holds on to God. That's the only point of hope for Job. And it's pretty small. The friends think they know what God would say. They know their Bibles, they've got their doctrine down pat. So they think they can just speak for God, but they don't consult God.
They're speaking from the flesh.
They're speaking from the flesh. And they're using their heads I don't even think they get as far as their emotions, let alone anything of the spirit. You know, that's all just out of the equation completely. When God shows up, he speaks to one person, the one who has been speaking to him. So he speaks to Job. He doesn't bother speaking to the friends. Now you think with all, you know, they were the ones who apparently knew everything about everything. Actually, we used to know a young man who told us with utter sincerity at the grand age of 20 or 21, but he actually sat there and he said, I know everything about everything. Well, I can read you with, you sort of look at him and think, are you serious? He's serious! He said that, you know, you can't tell me anything, that I know everything about everything.
Omniscient.
Huh?
Omniscient.
Well, he committed suicide, was it 2 years ago? But, I mean, you know, that kind of attitude doesn't get you in a good place. He made a lot of stupid decisions. Because, of course, he knew everything about everything, and so therefore he didn't want anybody else's input. That's just how we need somebody to play the part of God. Now, who is going to be God? It's a scary role, isn't it? Somebody please volunteer to be God. No one's going. No one's going to be God? No one's going. Okay. So just read this random collection of verses of the sorts of things that God says to Job in these couple of chapters.
Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place? 34, 19.
What verses you're reading, so as we know.
We can't quite read them.
I can't read them.
38, 34. I don't think I read 34.
No.
Can you lift up your voice?
34.
Yeah. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that an abundance of waters will cover you? And then 39:19. Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane?
Right. So God's strategy is not the expected one. We would think that God would come along and say to Job, you were right about this, you were wrong about this. Probably. Tell him about what was right and what was wrong. Doesn't go anywhere near it. So there's no condemnation of Job for any particular sin, but he also doesn't say, you're perfect, because he's not. He takes a totally different strategy, and that is he says, come on Job, look up, who am I? I am the Creator. Are you able to make the wind and the waves and the horse and the sun and the whatever else that goes on with all these things? Job, you realise that I'm above all of this. I know more than these friends know, that's implied, and I know more than you know too. Now we know that because we know chapter 1 of the story. So God is basically saying, look up and worship. He said, strengthen your relationship with God. So he hasn't given him any answers, and in fact, he never does give Job any answers. So we can't use this book to say, this is what God does to cause suffering. No, the book is too mysterious for that. We can't say much about God because it doesn't let us.
You just have to hang on to the fact that God is a good God and there's no evil in him.
Yes, we hold on to God and what his true characteristics are, including his ability to be creator, which involves an awful lot of wisdom, and the other attributes that you know, which Pat has mentioned about being a good God and other things. So it was, go back, Job, to what you know. And think about it. Use your imagination. Think about, look around. You know, look to see the absolute amazing capacity of God with every tiny bud and with the stars in the sky and with the animals that you see. We might sort of think ordinary stuff, but it's all extraordinary when it comes to how you make all of this. Job, I have this wisdom. And have it in hand. That's right. And then, the next thing, we have Job's answer. So we're going to have, Christine, can you do big Job again?
Yeah. So that's 42 verse number 6.
That's right.
Okay. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now and I will speak. I will question you and you shall answer me. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes.
Now, I don't think he doesn't repent in the sense of, well, this is my known sin and I'm going to turn away from it. Because there is no known sin named. But perhaps he feels within himself that he wants to show reverence to God, he wants to repent of any kind of arrogance he had in the process. But the friends never condemned him for the correct things anyway. They got everything wrong. And I can remember when I was still struggling with this church in Brisbane, and they were telling me how wicked I was, except they could never tell me like this particular sin. If they could tell me, you're wrong or bad for doing this particular thing, then I could evaluate it and I could work out, am I right or wrong? But it was vague. It was just that I'm just wicked, I'm unsubmissive, I'm a whole lot of other words. You think of all bad words and they all come out of their mouths. And I got to the point where I was thinking, I don't really know. I mean, am I that bad? I mean, I know I'm not perfect or anything like that, but I don't know what I've done wrong. And so you end up really getting stuck. And I also felt that in that period that my communication with God, it was like there was a big thick cloud in the middle. And I wasn't hearing from God anymore. Anyway, I thought, this one day, I thought, I've got to know what God thinks my sin is. Because that's the one that's important rather than what these church leaders think. And so I finally plucked up courage, expecting that God was going to squash me into the ground and want to be the end of me, which would have been pretty awful because I had a couple of small kids. But anyway, so I finally cried out to God inside me. I said, God, what is my sin? And the answer came immediately. Fear of man. They were barking up the wrong tree. Of course I had sinned. But as soon as God spoke those words, fear of man, it came with illumination, it came with forgiveness, it came with relief and release. I now had a clue where I'd gone wrong, but it wasn't doing any of those things that the church, which nothing fitted what they were talking about. So I wasn't sin-free, but it wasn't what they. I had actually given them too much power. I listened to them too much. I got myself scared too much. That was my sin. You see, the fear of God had to be greater than the fear of man. And that's where Job was needing to be shifted. Even though he was arguing against them all the time, you still end up feeling awful inside. Now, the end of the story, this is a brilliant reconciliation. God says to Job, I'm not going to read anymore, but I can just tell you what happens, and you probably know anyway. God says that he says, I am angry. This is the only thing he says to the friends. He says, I am angry with you, that's Eliphaz, and your friends. I'm angry with you. That's all God wants to say to them. And then he tells them that they have to get huge sacrifices. All 7 bulls, 7 lambs, and burnt offering. Now, a normal person in those days, if you'd committed a sin and you were going to come to the priest and you were going to bring a sacrifice, depending on how rich you were, the most you'd bring would be a sheep or a goat. And if you were poor, you'd bring some birds. Or if you couldn't even do that, you could bring some cereal or something. But the most would be a sheep. He says with these guys, you've got to bring 7, not sheep, but bulls. Now a bull that's what a king brings, or a high priest. It's something, it represents the sin of the people. Like, it's huge. So the wrong that these friends have done to Job, God considers on the scale of sins to be right up at the top. And we in the church, we're down the bottom. So we who will be pastoral carers, this is a warning. That the idea of, helping people, kind to people, all that sort of stuff, that's what we've got to do. But we better not do it like Job's friends did it. And yet we can. And that church did. And I've been in other places where I've had a taste of it as well. So Job did this big sacrifice and he was asked to pray for them. So that's what brought the reconciliation. Now that would have been hard for Job to pray, God, please forgive the sins of these people who've been so horrible to me. That was his job. And they had to bring those sacrifices, which would have come at considerable financial cost. And at the end we see Job was given the same number of kids again, and everything else was doubled. The sheep, the camels, the oxen, and the donkeys were all double what he had at the beginning. Now, that's not a lesson to say, if you do this, you can guarantee that God is going to increase your finances, the prosperity gospel, and all that. It's not for that purpose. But it's just a picture of God's blessing when we listen to one another properly. And also the reconciliation. I mean, even though they've been terrible. And we did go to visit that minister again. So up in Brisbane, way down in here, I would not choose to go to that church to make it my home church again. But I have some friends there. So I've just put a little summary. He said, Job, people get confused. They either think he's perfect or he's bad. No, he's just a normal Christian. I mean, he's a genuine believer. He's not perfect, but he's called righteous. All the way through, he's still called righteous. I mean, God doesn't change on that. He's just simply under great distress. And all of us, no matter how strong we think we are, if we get put in a tough situation, we will show our weaknesses. Job's friends don't respect him. They assume their own judgments are right, but they're wrong. God does not condemn Job and only speaks to Job, and he does say the friends are the ones who are seriously wrong and need to apologise with these sacrifices. Well, I'm going to call it lunchtime, at this point. Is that all right?
That's cool. Yeah.